Hello folks, it's me, DeMontropolis, and here I am taking a look at Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest. Developed by Konami and released in 1987, just a little under a year past the first game. During this time period, it's a bit of a running gag where sequels of popular games on the NES went in a completely different direction with its gameplay, and Simon's Quest is no exception. Despite that, this game was still determined to further flesh out the new franchise, and receive the reputation of a classic thanks to what it brings to the table. Recently, however, Simon's Quest has become controversial because it feels like it was designed as a Nintendo Power game, where it's better to just look up a walkthrough or a magazine to assist you instead of using the resources in-game. Regardless, let's explore through the game to see if there really is something of a classic after all these years in Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest. Unlike most other Castlevania games that have you trek through the areas outside and inside a castle, Simon's Quest instead features Simon Belmont exploring a huge open world made up of towns, forests, bridges, mansions, and many other settings. This is because the objective is different this time around. 7 years after the first game, Simon finds out he's been cursed by Dracula following their previous battle, and must explore Transylvania in search of Dracula's 5 body parts, which are scattered throughout and protected in 5 mansions influenced by Dracula's control. This lends itself to a theme of exploration enhanced by non-linear gameplay, and while there are some puzzles required to unlock new parts of the world, Simon is free to tackle these areas of the game at his own pace. Simon's Quest is the game that carries over and marries the concepts of both Castlevania 1 and Vampire Killer, taking inspiration from both games to flesh out its new gameplay. This includes having more action-based areas in between towns and mansions, such as forests and bridges, while also using hearts as currency for buying new items off of merchants. There are more concepts I could talk about, but the point is, after coming out of both these two games, it's great to see Simon's Quest get some inspiration out of them while still providing a new experience. While Vampire Killer dipped its toes into role-playing aspects, Simon's Quest fully realizes it and goes all in. Now, in between action areas with many enemies, there's 7 towns that act as safe spots for Simon to take a breather. Most towns have a church, which is the primary way for Simon to restore all his health, and there's also NPCs to talk to. They can give out small cryptic hints about what to do, tell half-truths, or lie out of fear of Dracula's wrath. There are also merchants, either out in the open or inside buildings, that Simon can buy items off of, most of which will prove to be very useful for his quest. As you learn the game, each town serves its own purpose and provides something different from the others. The 5th town, Ondol, has some of the funniest dialogue in the game, with random out-of-context lines like, "When I was your age, women loved me," or "Take my daughter, please." Like, geez man, you ever heard of a brothel before? The 6th town, Doina, has most of its citizens afraid of Simon for fear of what Dracula will do to them, while the 7th town, Yomi, is almost completely abandoned, which makes sense as it's the closest to Dracula's ruined castle. The only person there is this old lady who's just like, "Let's live together." Seriously? However, it's no secret that the game has suffered many mistranslations from the original Japanese text, making it too cryptic and impossible to understand the game with no help. If you really try to play this game blind, you realize how some puzzles are straight up impossible to figure out on your own. One particular puzzle involves the infamous Deborah Cliff, where outside of a hidden clue book, the only information you get on what to do comes from one of the NPCs in the 4th town, Aldra, who tells you, "Hit Deborah Cliff with your head to make a hole," which is straight up a lie and also plain stupid. There are 13 hidden clue books across the game that always tell the truth, and only one of them gives you some info on what to do with this puzzle, and it reads, "Wait for a soul with a red crystal on Deborah Cliff." This is another mistranslation. What you actually have to do is kneel at the cliff while holding the red crystal, and a tornado will eventually whisk you away to the next destination. In a similar stance of evolution, Simon's Quest also expands upon merchants and the sub-weapons you collect. As I've touched on before, merchants are found in all sorts of places, which include mansions and even caves. With the inventory having been expanded, not only are there way more sub-weapons to hold onto and switch between with just the toggle of the pause menu, but once you collect something, you hold onto it forever. One interesting sub-weapon is a laurel, which can be bought in bulk and grants Simon temporary invincibility. This is not only necessary to get past Poisonous Marsh without suffering much damage, but it also allows Simon to get past setups that are normally cheap, or act as a get-out-of-jail-free card if in danger. It's nice to have. Holy Water is one of your first sub-weapons that you get. Unlike the previous games, it has been nerfed so it no longer stuns or neutralizes enemy threats. Rather, it has been repurposed as Simon's primary way to disintegrate certain walls and floors in order to progress through the game, or uncover hidden merchants in certain areas. Due to interacting with terrain, Holy Water can also be used to detect fake floors. They are used sparingly across the game, but having Holy Water handy helps with getting past the most annoying ones, as the only other way of detecting fake floors is to observe enemy patterns to see if they randomly turn around. Best of all, Holy Water costs no hearts to make sense out of its new functions. Due to the open world nature and RPG influence brought into this game, unlocking more bits of the world and its items are more reliant on puzzles, or at the very least knowing how and when to use the most recent item you just bought. You aren't told right away what something does. You either consult NPCs to give you vague hints, or go out of your way to find those freaking clue books. Regardless, it's fun to accumulate knowledge about this game and put it into practice to help you get even more useful items or unlock more of the open world. Despite that, it's not just the Deborah Cliff puzzle that's cryptic. All the major puzzles required to open up more areas of the open world have very little clues, and if they do, they are tucked away in the most obscure places. For example, the only hint in-game that you get about using a blue crystal to drain a lake is tucked away in these grounded blocks in this one forest, which can only be found by throwing holy water at this one random spot. It says, "To replenish Earth, kneel by the lake with the blue crystal," which is actually a good hint, but keep in mind, draining the lake is the only way to get to Rover Mansion, which needs to be cleared before you access Braham Mansion. And that mansion has the only item in the game that actually reveals these cluebook locations to you. So without that item, the only way you'd figure out where that important cluebook is located is either talk to one of the many NPCs who start with clues to Dracula's riddle, you spam holy water on every single pog block in sight, or you just find it by accident. First time I found this cluebook, it was by accident. I could give more examples about how cryptic these puzzles can get, but I've already proven my point. But we can't talk about more sub-weapons without talking about Simon's trusty vampire killer, which still remains his primary combat tool. Whip speed is slightly faster, and it still feels great and responsive to beat up monsters, even if they might take 4 hits to kill. The best part about the whip, however, is that whip upgrades actually matter across the game. In the first game, you started out with an inferior whip, but you upgrade automatically to the whip's best form, which you hold onto so much that it might as well be your normal state. In Simon's Quest, there are 5 whips across the game, and you collect them throughout the length of the game, usually bought in towns. The only difference is that they get slightly longer and double in power exponentially with each whip. That last bit is important because enemy HP also increases exponentially across the game. You really feel yourself get stronger with each new whip, with the Flame Whip especially being the satisfying culmination of all the grinding you had to do, now allowing you to burn away evil in just 2 hits or less. Some of the sub-weapons you get are really good and give you reliable ways to attack enemies in ranges that the whip cannot reach. The Sacred Flame serves as the true successor to Holy Water in terms of trapping and damaging enemies, and for any Mega Man fans, it may remind you of Flame Blast. There are going to be a lot of enemies on platforms below Simon where the whip just won't reach without putting Simon in harm's way, so the arc of the weapon helps trap enemies and defeat them quickly, only using 1 heart per flame. Next is the Golden Knife, by far the best sub-weapon in the game. While every knife uses 2 hearts, it comes out instantly and has infinite range in a straight line. Hitting an enemy with the knife makes it explode into a flame that traps the enemy to do lots of damage, more than the Sacred Flame, and hurts other enemies who pass by it. However, While the Sacred Flame and Golden Knife are great sub-weapons, a lot of other sub-weapons are pretty useless by comparison. The Golden Knife has lower tier knives that you are meant to get before it, such as the Silver Knife and regular dagger. The dagger only travels a very short range, roughly the same distance your whip can cover, but covering it at a slower speed than your whip. The Silver Knife has infinite range and can pierce through enemies, but while it isn't as useless as the dagger, there are very little scenarios where the piercing comes in handy and it quickly gets outclassed by the Golden Knife. There's also a Diamond, which bounces off floors, walls, and ceilings, but it has some problems. The layout design doesn't allow the ricochet behavior to really shine, the weapon is a little buggy sometimes, and since the Diamond does the same damage as Sacred Flame does per hit, you're just better off using Sacred Flame in any scenario for better results. Lastly, there is a Garlic that can only be used for summoning 2 dudes across 2 cemeteries to get specific items, meaning for the entire game, you only need to pay for 2 cloves. Arguably the most innovative aspect of Simon's Quest is the new day and night cycle, which not only ties into the theme of Simon running out of time in his life, but it also enhances the RPG elements and fleshes out the world a bit more. The general rule is that during the daytime, enemies are weaker and the towns are open for you to interact with the NPCs and go inside the buildings to do business. However, when it's nightfall, enemies are tougher to kill, having twice as much HP, but drop bigger heart rewards than they normally do. Towns are also closed off at nighttime, as the NPCs go inside to hide from the monsters who invade these towns, like zombies and crows. It's a fun mechanic that requires you to strategize how you want to make the most out of each day and night in order to be as efficient as possible. This bit also ties into the game having multiple endings. There are only 3 different endings, but the one you get is based on how quickly you were able to beat the game. In the bad and normal endings, Simon does not survive the final battle, and that doesn't sound like a happy way to end the game. Getting the good ending encourages players to take advantage of this day and night cycle, and it means you have to plan out what you have to get done for each day and night in order to get all the items you need so you can get the game done within 7 days or less. It also helps that time stops if you are inside a town building or a mansion, which can help provide a safe area of relief from the clock temporarily. However, the day and night cycle has problems that don't seem to have been accounted for. To start, there is no item or mechanic that can accelerate time, so if your next objective is located in a specific town and it just happens to turn nighttime, well, too bad, you're forced to wait out the night. Even worse is when you already have enough sufficient hearts, and there's no point in killing enemies who roam the town. It isn't wrong to just sit still and go on your phone or something, but the design of a game shouldn't operate in this way. It only just takes you out of the game. The game signifies day and night with a big bar of text, and while the quotes are iconic to the series, it forcibly interrupts and stops gameplay for a couple seconds, with no way to skip the message. And given it's the same few messages over and over across the game, it can get annoying fast, especially if you're not up to the standards of what the game expects of you. Speaking of which, there's no way to speed up text in the game other than outright skipping text. This goes for NPC dialogue and cluebook text, which reads itself out at a pretty slow rate and you have to let it play out. It's especially bad for clue books, because if you accidentally skip the text of a clue book, the only way you can read that same clue again is to reset the room you're in by triggering a transition from another room. And if you are in a large mansion, you'll have to leave and re-enter the entire room just to reread a book you might have accidentally skipped. Speaking of mansions, these are the main points of interest for Simon to collect the 5 body parts of Dracula, with each mansion housing 1 body part needed to beat the game. And while only 2 of them have a boss fight, that's not what makes them interesting. Rather, the mansions create large complexes with multiple routes and paths to take, some of which are dead ends. Ultimately, it helps enforce the theme of exploration with them being designed the way they are. You also can't just pick up the body part and leave. You need to find a merchant who sells an oak stake, a one-use sub-weapon whose only purpose is to break the seal protecting the body parts. Mansions also have more aggressive enemies in them than what you usually encounter in the outside areas, some placements of which can really test your resource management. Lastly, they have their own types of traps, such as fake or breakable terrain. They don't appear too much to the point where you have to spam holy water everywhere, but just enough that you can learn their placements easily. I also like that most of Dracula's body parts aren't just items required to beat the game. You can equip them separately from your sub-weapon to give you a passive ability, which is a really cool concept. My favorite is Dracula's Rib, which puts a shield right in front of you just like how you could in Vampire Killer. Granted, you cannot walk with a shield up, unlike in Vampire Killer, but there's a good few enemies who shoot fireballs unpredictably, and laughing them off is very satisfying. Outside of Dracula's Rib, however, all the other body parts have very niche uses that it really isn't worth using them over the rib. You might as well call Dracula's heart a bloody crystal, because it only has use for solving one mandatory puzzle and may as well be grouped with the others. Dracula's eyeball is useful if you're clue hunting across the game, but the most important clues are ones that you won't even have the eyeball for, as I've mentioned earlier, and it can't even detect breakable or fake floors. Dracula's nail allows your whip to break walls, but given the holy water already does that and covers more area, it kinda undermines this body part's function. All in all, these three body parts have very situational uses that don't warrant usage across the game in a very helpful way like the rib does. And to top it all off, there are two items that straight up have no use other than being mandatory. I don't get it. You have a system where the body parts give you a passive ability, but Dracula's ring ditches that and has no use other than it's mandatory, so go get it. The other item like this is the magic cross, which you have to obtain from the most boring boss fight in the game. Oh yeah, bosses. There are only 3 of them in this game: Death, Carmilla, and Dracula as the final boss. All of them are horribly easy, primarily because they share the same stun that enemies receive when struck by sub-weapons. This stun freezes movement completely until it's over, meaning the best sub-weapons can be used repeatedly to stun lock bosses until you beat them. Death is ironically the trickiest at first, as you have to lure him to the ground while dodging his sickles in order for Sacred Flame to work. Carmilla is so slow and boring you don't even need to stun lock her, and Dracula it practically requires you to in order to have a safe defeat, because his fang attacks are extremely hard to dodge without using a laurel to escape all harm. I'm honestly glad that there are only 3 bosses, because they all feel like afterthoughts in a game with an arguably bigger scope than its predecessor. Another memorable aspect about Castlevania 2 is the music. Although the scale of the soundtrack is quite small, to the point where you'll be hearing the 4 same songs consistently throughout most of the game, boy do I tell you, it is fantastic! The songs have short loops, but they're all A+ quality earworms, and every single one perfectly captures the essence of its corresponding atmosphere. The Silence of Daylight is one of the catchiest town themes you'll ever hear, period. Monster Dance evokes a dangerous but frantic vibe that comes with being at the mercy of horrible knights, while Bloody Tears is one of the most iconic Castlevania tunes of all time. My favorite song here is Dwelling of Doom, perfect for the fun houses of terror. And lastly, a Requiem is a beautiful finale song to cap off your adventure. Almost brought me to tears at one point, and for those who know me, that's almost impossible to pull off. The visual and audible presentation are also great, and might actually be the game's greatest strength. The graphics are so appropriate that the game's very tone tickles the senses in a way that makes you feel like you're a part of this universe, or at least a temporary resident. When combined with what are backgrounds that spur the imagination like ominous mountains, graveyards, woodlands, and stalactite-filled caves, it creates a memorable world that you'll want to visit again and again. Enemies are mean-looking and all the more frightening for it, and even Simon looks better with a new sprite and everything, despite the fact that sometimes you could just lose his arms. In terms of atmosphere, my favorite area is Dracula's castle. Although it's the final area of the game, it's not ridiculously hard as you would expect. These are the abandoned ruins of Castlevania, matching the aesthetic of Block 1 from the first game, and there are no enemies or any obstacles that could hurt or kill you. Even without them, the mere drab and effect it casts on the world around you still seeps in as you go deeper and deeper into the ruins, and the music helps capture that feeling of increasing isolation. What does suck about the presentation is that every time you die, the checkpoint spawns you immediately where you died, and I mean immediately, like in front of a bottomless pit you fell into immediately. It's not uncommon for people to die consecutively because they are not prepared to appear in front of a bottomless pit or right in the heart of enemy swarms. And speaking of dying, there is no way to gain lives. You start with 3 and game over after 3 deaths. Granted, you do have unlimited continues, and given the game's loose restrictions, you will beat the game. However, game overing does reset your experience points and heart count to 0, so there is at least some punishment in that aspect. Now for miscellaneous stuff. Given this is an RPG, you are expected to do some grinding for stuff like hearts or EXP to stay ahead of the game. And while that isn't a bad thing, there are some areas that can be a bit grind heavy, in the sense that you must grind to get stuff you need. A good example is the very start of the game, where you're given just enough hearts to buy either a holy water or a white crystal. Then you have to grind not just for the other item, but also for your next whip upgrade, be it the thorn whip or the chain whip. Another big grind spot is for the Morning Star, a whip upgrade you really want because you need to buy it before getting the flame whip, and you'll start noticing enemies become resistant to even the chain whip. Thankfully, there's more to getting level ups than what it seems on the surface. It is the only way for Simon to immediately heal up outside of a church, and in the face of danger can be a real lifesaver. Not just that, but every level up increases your health and resistance to enemy damage, which is very important in making sure that any silly mistakes you make become less punishing as a result. As with how Mega Man 2 introduced passwords to its franchise, Simon's Quest would go on to do the same thing. Granted, you do have to game over before you can actually look at a password, but for a game that's more than quadruple the length of the first game, saving your progress and being able to give Simon whatever build you want with the right password was a great addition. Stair climbing is returned, and thankfully enemies are spaced away from them so you won't be wrestling your controls trying to use your sub-weapons next to stairs. However, they present a new issue. Due to the sheer vertical scope of towns and mansions, it can be very tedious going up and down, with nothing actually happening other than you trying to move as quickly as possible. This game has very short iframes when Simon gets hit, and what sucks is that there is no blinking, making it difficult to tell how long they actually last. As such, one hit can usually lead to another, and rarely a full-on death combo. The actual challenges that enemies pose is very minimal due to the variety being lackluster and repetitive across the game, as many of them just kinda walk back and forth. Mostly you'll be getting hit either from your patience running thin and making you do careless mistakes, or some enemies like slimes hitting you in erratic movements. Some enemies and obstacles are kinda haphazardly used across the game and may only appear once or twice, like these moving platforms where you have to time your jumps using the momentum of its movement, which are almost never used consecutively outside of this one path. The biggest crime in this area are these rock traps in Bodley Mansion, which only appear in one screen in the entire game. It's not even required to interact with them either, because going past them leads to a dead end and wasted time. Why were they even added to the game in the first place? So in the end, I have 18 pros and 16 cons. While very different from almost every other game in the franchise, Simon's Quest still stands on its own 2 feet with a unique but welcoming gameplay formula. I enjoy replaying the game simply because of how strong Simon can get once he obtains the best equipment, and while the game is held back by the arcanity being the only real challenge to overcome, I think this game is worth your time. But unless you have buttloads of free time, it will be your best option, as much as it may pain you to use some sort of guide. So with that, I'm going to give Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest a rating of 6 out of 10. Decent. And that's the end of the video. If you like what you saw, consider giving a like and subscribe to my channel. As per usual, check the links in the description if you want more out of my channel, or want to join my Discord server, DeMontropolis. And I want to say thank you all for your patience. Hopefully going forward, I'll be getting these videos out at a faster rate. As far as my next project is, I'll be getting back to the Mega Man series with Mega Man 4. That one's going to be real interesting to dissect. With that said, I'll be signing off. Take care, folks.